Unit 5. All right, here we go. We're talking about political participation. So, a lot of things about voting. So, we're going to start right off with a little history lesson here on amendments to the Constitution that have impacted voting. And on the front list, 15, 17, 19, 24th, and 26th Amendments, you're going to know all five of those on this one card. So, we'll put those in the back. And on the back side, you could just put 15, 17, 19, 24, 26, probably skip a line after each one. So that way you've got room to write. But it's pretty short. All right, so before we get there, let's talk a little bit about what the Constitution said about voting. And this is, if I ask students this question, invariably they always say that only white propertied people could vote at the beginning of white propertied men, I should say, could vote at the beginning of the Constitution. And they're not wrong when they say that, in the sense that largely that was true, but they're wrong in the sense that it wasn't always true. In fact, Article 1, Section 2, Clause 1 of the Constitution actually talks about who shall be able to vote for the House of Representatives. And it says, in each state shall have the qualifications requisite for electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislature, which means if you could vote for the legislature in the state, you could vote for the national legislature. So it was up to the states entirely. By the way, very quickly after the founding, the property requirements were mostly dropped off. I think I talked about that in an earlier lesson. So let's look at these amendments that do guarantee rights for voter. Okay, so the 15th Amendment is the first one that affects voting. And it said that vote cannot be denied due to race. Vote cannot be denied due to race. And that allowed freedmen, free black former slaves to vote across the country. Now, as we've already stated before, blacks could vote in several states in the North. And matter of fact, for a time, blacks could even vote in North Carolina, a slaveholding state. And so this is in 1870, just after the Civil War. Matter of fact, this overturned the Dred Scott case. Let's take a peek at that. Benjamin Curtis, Justice Benjamin Curtis Robbins, he wrote the dissent to the Dred Scott case. Remember, the dissent is a person who disagrees with the majority's decision. And he said this about Dred Scott. He's saying why Dred Scott was wrong in what it said. And he said, of this, there can be no doubt. At the time of the ratification of the Articles of Confederation, all free native-born inhabitants of the states of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, and North Carolina, see, there's North Carolina, though descended from African slaves, were not only citizens of those states, but such of them as had the necessary qualifications possessed the franchise of electors, which means the right to vote, the franchise, on equality with all other citizens. So that just goes to prove that freed African Americans in multiple states actually had the right to vote if they had those qualifications. So it's just not true to say that only white propertied men could vote, although that's largely true. But at this point now, no state can deny an African American the right to vote after the 15th Amendment. Unfortunately, because it doesn't get enforced by a Civil Rights Act until 1965, unfortunately, the reality is that Jim Crow laws did keep many African Americans from voting. And we'll talk more about that, or we did talk about it in the Unit 3 Civil Rights Unit. All right, 17th Amendment, direct election of senators. So it used to be that senators were chosen by the state legislatures, and then in 1913 it was chosen to direct election by the people. So just tag along that they're elected by state legislatures originally. I think, again, that's something we probably already talked about. 19th Amendment. I might have gone too fast there. Direct election of legislatures, but you can pause if you need to. All right, 19th Amendment. Vote cannot be denied due to sex. Again, women could vote in many states by 1920, but there were some that didn't allow them to vote. So the 19th Amendment was passed in order to guarantee that. Just a reminder, which is a cool American history fact, is that Wyoming in 1869 became the first place ever in world history to allow full women suffrage. Suffrage meaning the right to vote. So that's pretty cool. Like, America was ahead of equal rights for women in certain places in our country. We were far ahead of Europe and other places, and in Wyoming being, right at the top, as being the first place to allow full women's suffrage. Very, very cool distinction for Wyoming. Okay, pause if you need to. All right, 24th Amendment abolished the poll tax. Now, remember, I said that the 15th Amendment, you couldn't deny someone the right to vote by race. Well, what a lot of states in the South did was deny the right to vote through other means. They would have things like poll taxes. And then if you didn't pay the poll tax, you had to retroactively pay all the poll taxes if you hadn't voted in the past. And so that kept a lot of poor blacks from voting. And then they would have like literacy tests where you had to, in some cases, recite the Constitution word for word in order to be able to vote. And so this restricted not only poor blacks, but also poor whites. It was something ridiculous where South Carolina, somewhere around the order of in the early 1900s, you'd have a state that was about the same size as South Carolina in the north, but the northern state had 10 times the voting population of South Carolina because South Carolina had so many restrictions on who could vote that a very small percentage of white people could vote, pretty much only. So abolished the poll tax. A poll tax was one of those ways of trying to keep blacks from voting. So poll taxes in the South kept poor blacks from voting. So get that. That amendment, again, was passed, right around the same year. It was ratified the same year as the Civil Rights Act. All right, pause if you need to. All right, and the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18. It used to be 21 pretty much everywhere. Again, a state could have made it 18, and some did, but this became universal in 1971. And it was influenced by Vietnam. You could be drafted and go to war and die in Vietnam, but you couldn't vote. And so people just thought that was really an injustice. By the way, 26th Amendment also has the distinction of being the fastest amendment ever ratified. From the time Congress passed it with 2/3 of both houses, it only took 100 days or just over 3 months for the ratification to happen in enough states. So that's pretty cool. Most of them took, most took 2 or 3 years. All right, moving on. 5.2, models explaining voter behavior. So there's 4 types of models that political scientists use that explain how people vote. So you're going to write this on the front side of your card. You got rational choice voting. The only reason it's blue is just to remind me of what's coming next. So you don't have to write that in a different color. Retrospective voting, prospective voting, and party line voting. Most of these are probably like pretty obvious of what they mean. Like retrospective means looking back. Prospective means looking forward. Party line. Okay, so you probably understand what they already mean, but you need to make sure you know them. So let's go through them really quick. Backside number 1 to 4. Pause if you need to. All right, 1. The rational base. Rational means that their voting is based on what is perceived to be in the citizens' individual interest. So you have a congressperson who brought some money back to the district of yours, and you ended up getting a job as a result of that. So you're like, hey, I'm voting for that person. They got me a job. So it's your best interest, your individual interest. I would say most people probably don't vote this way. 2, retrospective voting. This is a little more common. When you have a president running for re-election, this is like a big part of the voting is retrospective. What does that mean? Well, it's voting to decide if the party or the candidate should be re-elected based on the recent past. So do you think they've done a good job? If you do, then you go ahead and vote for them. And if you think they've done a bad job, then you say, I'm tossing the bum out. So like, for example, in 1984, President Ronald Reagan ran for re-election, and he asked people, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And so it's 1984. You better off now than you were in 1980. And most people were like, yup. So Reagan wins big. Then in 1992, Reagan's vice president Bush was running. And if you sat and asked yourself, are you better off 4 years ago than you were now? Most people were like, probably not. So they voted President Clinton in. So this sort of idea of retrospective voting is an important key, especially when someone's running for re-election. Prospective voting. This is like you predicting how they'll do in the future. So voting based on how a party or candidate will perform in the future. If you have 2 candidates and neither one of them have ever held office, then you're just kind of thinking about who's best qualified, maybe who aligns with my ideology. Talk more about ideology and voting in a minute. And lastly, party line voting or partisan voting. This probably isn't going to shock you, but party line means that you're just going to go down, you're going to check every D. That's a Democrat, I vote for them. Democrat, I vote for them. Democrat, vote for them. I don't even know who they are, but they're a Democrat, I vote for them. Or they're a Republican. Boom. I've never even heard of this person, but they have an R next to their name. I'm voting for them. So that's party line voting. So you support one party across your ballot. Partisan voting. Supporting one party across one ballot. So you just kind of check off all the R's or you check off all the D's. This has become actually more common in modern times. It used to be much more common that you vote for one person for president and another person for the Senate or the House. And now, though, people are much more likely to vote, R all the way down or D all the way down. All right, last thing on this big lesson, 5.3, impact on voting behavior. And it's something, political term that we need to know. It's called political efficacy. That's how you say that second word, efficacy. So what is your political efficacy? And this is a huge determination on whether you actually will show up on election day and actually vote. Political efficacy, 5.3. Pause if you need to. Here we go. Political efficacy means this. How well do you understand political issues? So if you don't pay attention to the news and you don't know political issues, the chance you vote is like bad. Like you're probably not going to go out and freaking vote. But if you pay attention to the news or you take like a class like this, like AP government, and then you learn about the political ideology and you learn about how the system works, your chance of voting goes up a lot because you're kind of informed. And so the idea is this: low information voters, and low information means voters who really don't know anything about politics and don't pay attention, they don't vote. But people who are high information voters, people that pay attention to the news, are far more likely to actually show up and vote. And by the way, low information voters tend to be younger because young people don't pay attention, and high information voters tend to be older. So just because you're a low information voter now doesn't mean you will be when you're 50. That changes dramatically. That's why voting, the people who vote gets increases as people age. The people who are least likely to vote are young people. The people most likely to vote are over 60. How well do you understand political issues? Matter of fact, let's just look at this chart really quick. Here's what they did. They asked people all kinds of information about the news. So that's that, okay? And then they have on the side, see where it says information on the left-hand side? It says 5th percent, 50%, 95th percent. So 5th percent would be like someone who didn't know anything about what's going on in the news. 95th percent is someone who they knew their stuff. And then what they said is they asked the I, which is what ideology do you consider yourself? Do you consider yourself a moderate, a liberal, or a conservative? And then they use that as a predictor of what party they voted for. Like, how did they actually identify with the party? And the thing is that a lot of people didn't necessarily associate their party with their ideology. Now we think of Democrat, liberal, conservative, Republican. But if you look back in the 70s through 97, look at the 95th percentile. So when it came to ideology, it was a 55% predictor of your party. That was it. That's all it is. That's pretty wild. If you ask the average voter, now go to 2000, okay, and look at the 50th percentile. So that's like the average voter in terms of information. If you asked them whether they were liberal, moderate, or conservative, or none of the above, their answer was only 63% predictive of what they'd tell you 2 years later. So I'm sorry, that was the point I left out. This is predictor of what they'd tell you 2 years later. So if you look at the 95th percentile, if you ask someone if they're a moderate, conservative, or liberal in the 95th percentile, there was a 91% chance they would tell you the same thing in 2 years. But if you were someone in the 5th percentile, it was only 28% chance in 2002 that they'd tell you a predictive value. So someone would say yeah, I'm a moderate. And then 2 years later, they tell you something totally different. It's because they don't really know what moderate means. They don't know what conservative means. They don't know what liberal means. But if you ask someone their party, notice how party is higher. So if you associate at the 5th percentile as a Republican or Democrat, there was a 70% prediction that you would say the same political party. And that's because your political identification is much more related to your family and your peers than it is that your ideology. But interestingly, what this also means is that there's a lot of people who claim to be either liberal or conservative and actually vote in the other party. It's because they don't know the issues very well. And that's the point. If you don't know the issues well, then there won't be a lot of consistency in like what you're voting. Like you could think I'm a liberal and really not understand the issues, and actually in reality you're conservative, and you're like voting for the party that goes against what you actually believe because you didn't even know it. So this is why you need to be informed. And the more informed you are, the more efficacy you have. The more efficacy you have, the more likely you are to turn out and vote. All right. Here's another question for efficacy. Do you think your vote matters? Efficacy. Do you think your vote matters? People with high efficacy think it does, and so they will go vote. They will crawl over broken glass to make sure they vote. And lastly, just to make the point, which I already said, higher efficacy. You know more about the political issues. You believe your vote matters. You are much more likely to vote. That makes sense, right? All right, cool. That's a lesson. Lot to swallow, lot to practice. Thanks, guys.